What if a message from thousands of years ago is still echoing today, but no one is listening? A message not spoken by a king, a priest, or a scholar, but by a man no one expected to carry the voice of heaven. The warnings were clear, the words were sharp, but the people turned away. His name was Amos, a fig tree farmer, a shepherd from a quiet, unremarkable village. And yet, God chose him to declare a prophecy so uncomfortable, so piercing, that entire cities ignored it and paid the price. What did Amos see that terrified the powerful and convicted the corrupt? What did he hear from God that made him rise from obscurity and confront a nation asleep at the wheel? And more urgently, what if the same silence that greeted his words back then is still surrounding us now? If something in your spirit feels like it's being stirred, like this is more than just a story, but a mirror comment 777 below as a sign of alignment, of awakening, of saying to God, I'm listening now. That small act may carry more weight than you think. And to every one of you who has supported this journey through super thanks, thank you. You're not just fueling content, you're helping revive the voices the world tried to forget. Because what Amos said is not just ancient prophecy, it's present truth. And what's coming next may explain why your life has felt like it's been pressing towards something bigger, something holy, urgent, and completely unseen. Keep watching. The silence is about to break. What did Amos prophesy that no one listened to? You'll be shocked by this. Amos was born in Tekoa, a quiet, almost invisible village nestled deep in the heart of Judah, the kind of place people passed by without a second glance. But if you paused long enough to look around, you'd find yourself surrounded by a haunting kind of beauty. Vast open fields that whispered in the wind, golden hills blazing under the scorching sun like smoldering altars, and fig trees that swayed lazily as if humming ancient songs only the wind could interpret. This was a land of shepherds, shaped not by politics or power, but by the slow, the simple rhythm of country life, the kind of rhythm that taught a man to listen before he spoke. Here, in a place almost forgotten by the world, a boy was quietly growing up. No signs announced his birth. No prophet foresaw his rise. But even in silence, heaven had taken notice. Amos was his name, and though no one could have imagined it at the time, he was being formed to become one of the most disruptive, soul-piercing voices of his generation, a voice that would confront kings, shake sanctuaries, and expose injustice with a force no one saw coming. From an early age, Amos lived a life that seemed unchanging, almost predestined. Each morning, he followed the same path, tending his family's sheep along the rugged hillsides, eyes constantly scanning for danger, ears trained for the rustle of predators. His world was the wind, the dust, the bleating of lambs, and the quiet patience of waiting. And when he wasn't with the flocks, he gave himself to another task that required just as much vigilance, caring for the fig trees. Not just any figs, but sycamore figs, stubborn fruit that only ripened if cut at the right time. It was tedious work, meticulous and repetitive, demanding precision, calloused hands, and an understanding of timing few possessed. Amos had that. He had the hands of a worker and the eyes of a watcher, discerning, alert, always listening. In the hush between tasks, he attuned himself to the whispers of nature. He read the skies. He noticed patterns, and though no one around him gave it much thought, heaven was quietly shaping a prophet in the fields, not through visions or angelic visitations, but through silence, observation, and discipline. To the casual passerby, Amos was just another country shepherd, perhaps even a bit of a recluse. He had no title, no formal education, no temple access. He lived far from the cities with their noise, chaos, and constant noise of ambition. Who would take notice of a man like that? And yet, there was something different. Even Amos didn't fully understand it, but it was there, flickering behind his gaze, a restlessness, a simmering awareness of how wrong the world had become. His eyes, though quiet, carried the weight of something deeper, as if they saw injustice where others saw routine, as if he could feel, even in Tekoa, the tremors of moral collapse rippling outward from cities he'd never even visited. And when travelers passed through, sharing stories about Samaria's grandeur, about its soaring wealth, its indulgent luxuries, and the polished lives of the elite, Amos listened. But it wasn't the gold or architecture that caught his attention. It was the shadows beneath the splendor, the oppression of the poor, the unchecked greed of the powerful, the way the cries of the needy were drowned by songs of the satisfied. Something inside him reacted, not just emotionally, but spiritually. It wasn't anger. It was deeper than that. It was indignation, holy, persistent, and impossible to ignore. Have you ever felt a fire burn in you that you couldn't name? One that didn't start from pain, but from seeing others suffer while everyone else looked away? Amos didn't speak of it. He didn't yet have the words. But as the world moved blindly forward, a greater voice began to stir inside him. It didn't come with thunder or dreams. It came softly, like pressure building beneath the earth. Silent, yet unmistakable. Divine, but not fully understood. And when the wind swept across the hills, it carried more than dust and heat. It carried a whisper, a call. Could it be that even then, God was already speaking, not in words, but in weight, not in visions, but in the ache for justice? He didn't know it yet, but heaven was waiting. And one day, that silence would break, not with comfort, but with confrontation, not with approval, but with judgment. That day unfolded like all the others. The sun rose slowly over the edge of the hills, stretching golden light across the land, bathing Tekoa in warm hues of orange and amber. The sheep stirred gently, bells chiming softly as Amos guided them up the familiar paths. The air was filled with the quiet harmony of rustling leaves and birdsong hidden among the trees. Everything moved according to its usual rhythm, calm, steady, predictable. But deep within the stillness, something unseen had already begun to stir, and before the day's end, the course of one man's life would be altered forever. While standing alone among the hills, watching over his grazing flock, Amos felt something shift. It did not come in words, nor in visions. It arrived like a weight settling on his chest, not heavy with fear, but charged with a presence too vast to explain. A slow, rising heat traveled up his spine, igniting something within. The wind, which had always been his companion, now moved with an unfamiliar current. It no longer whispered as it once did. It pulsed. It pressed against him. It carried something invisible yet undeniable. This was not imagination. It was calling. Amos had never thought himself worthy of anything beyond the soil he walked and the sheep he led. He was a man of fields and fig trees, used to silence and solitude. Yet in that silence, a voice had entered, not like thunder, but like fire beneath the surface. And suddenly, he understood. The Creator of the universe was commissioning him, not for a task of comfort, but for confrontation. God was sending him north to the kingdom of Israel, not to blend in, but to speak out. The message would not flatter. It would pierce. He would confront rulers and priests. He would expose the greed and injustice that had taken root in a land once called blessed. There would be no applause. There would be resistance. But the instruction was clear. The crimes of the powerful could no longer go unchallenged. And who was he? A man with no lineage of prophets, no scrolls of training, no pulpit or platform. Just a shepherd, a dresser of sycamore figs, a man of rough hands, quiet spirit, and hidden fire. His instinct may have been to shrink back to let someone more eloquent, more educated, more acceptable take the assignment. But there was no room for hesitation. When heaven speaks, obedience must follow. He knew the road ahead would be steep, but he also knew that to ignore the call would be to deny the very reason he had been formed. And so, Amos left the fields of Tekoa behind and began his journey north, not knowing exactly what he would find. The kingdom of Israel awaited him, prosperous on the outside, but rotten on the inside, and Amos carried the message that would be like thunder, breaking the false silence of that place. The road to the kingdom of Israel was long, winding through heat and dust, through quiet valleys and restless hills. Amos walked it alone, carrying little more than his staff, the strength shaped by years in the fields, and the invisible fire of a command he dared not ignore. He didn't carry scrolls or strategies, only the weight of obedience and the words forming slowly in his bones. As he drew closer to the borders of Israel, the stories he had once heard in whispers began to unfold in more disturbing detail. Israel was flourishing, at least on the surface. Cities sparkled with energy. Trade was booming. Palaces gleamed like polished stones under the sun. The people feasted. The rulers celebrated. The temples overflowed with song. It was a kingdom dressed in gold, perfumed with success. But Amos had spent his life reading signs in the skies, in the land, in the quiet silences of sheep. It didn't take him long to recognize the fracture beneath the facade. He could see it even before stepping fully into the city. The gleam was too bright, the songs too loud, the streets too perfect, all signs of a kingdom that was hiding its sickness behind spectacle. And when he entered Samaria, the capital itself, the reality was undeniable. The city dazzled. Wealth hung in the air like incense. Men in fine linen strolled beside market stalls spilling with spices, gold, and rare fabrics. The laughter of nobles drifted down from terraces, where wine flowed like water and plates never emptied. Even the houses of worship glowed with decoration pillars inlaid with costly materials. Choirs rehearsed with precision. Priests adorned in ceremonial robes. At first glance, it looked like the favor of God had drenched the land. But Amos knew better. He turned into narrower streets, stepped behind the golden veil, and there, the kingdom's hidden face revealed itself. There were families crouched in shadows, faces gaunt, eyes dim, poor laborers, worn down from endless toil, dragged their feet past storehouses they would never enter. Slaves with calloused hands and bent backs worked until collapse, all to uphold the comfort of those who never noticed them. Children, barefoot and hungry, watched the carriages roll by, each wheel crushing hope a little more. It wasn't just inequality. It was injustice institutionalized. Justice had been privatized, bought, sold, and monopolized by the powerful. What should have flowed like a river had been dammed for profit. What should have been holy had become hollow. Religion, meant to be the soul of the nation, had decayed into performance. The altars were lavish, but the hearts were untouched. Offerings overflowed, but repentance was absent. What once was sacred had become a stage. Amos didn't need time to reflect. He saw it instantly, the great reversal. The poor were crushed. The rich were untouchable. The priests were complicit. The people had strayed far from covenant, but pretended as if nothing had changed. As he walked through the wide streets and into the hidden alleys of Samaria, his feet crossed both luxury and lack. He passed vendors shouting in crowded markets, musicians rehearsing in temple courts, nobles feasting behind embroidered curtains. But beneath every sound, he heard a groaning, not from mouths, but from the spirit of a people weighed down by sin they refused to acknowledge. And through it all, one certainty became clear. The message Amos carried would not merely be difficult to hear. It would be like a sharpened blade drawn before the faces of those who insisted on keeping their eyes shut. Not only unwelcome, it would be violently resisted. It would cut through illusions. It would force a reckoning. Still, the fire in his bones refused to be quenched. The opportunity to speak came faster than Amos expected. He was in Samaria, surrounded by the city's luxury and illusion. When the moment opened, there were no ceremonies, no invitations, no preparations. Amos simply raised his voice, and it was as if the sky itself roared. He began with words that shattered the air. The Lord will roar from Zion, and he will make his voice heard from Jerusalem. It wasn't a soft introduction. It was thunder, not metaphorical, but spiritual, splitting the atmosphere like a blade drawn in a room full of tension. The marketplace murmurs faded for a moment. People stopped mid-step. Some turned their heads. Others leaned closer, trying to understand who this stranger was that dared to speak with such fierce certainty. There he stood, dressed like a shepherd, weathered by sun and wind, carrying no credentials, no scrolls, no priestly robe. To the crowds, he looked like a man out of place, yet his voice carried weight, an unnatural, divine weight, the kind that made even the careless listener hold their breath. Amos began with the nations around them, one by one. He condemned their brutalities, their bloodshed, their betrayal of justice. He named Damascus, Gaza, Tyre, Edom, Ammon, Moab, declaring the wrath of God against their violence and cruelty. At first, the people of Israel listened with a strange satisfaction. After all, wasn't it refreshing to hear a prophet take aim at their enemies? Wasn't justice finally being declared against the wicked nations beyond their borders? But then, something shifted, like the growl of a lion suddenly turning toward its prey. Amos changed direction. He no longer pointed outward. His voice deepened, sharpened. His gaze turned straight toward the people of Israel. And in that moment, the roar came for them. He condemned the ones who lived in luxury while the poor were crushed beneath their feet. He spoke of leaders who twisted justice into a business transaction, of judges who sold verdicts for silver, of religious leaders who transformed sacred worship into performance and gain. And then came the blade. You who crush the poor and demand grain tribute, you have built luxurious houses of hewn stone, but you will not live in them. You have planted pleasant vineyards, but you will not drink their wine. It suddenly, each word was like an arrow loosed from heaven, not aimed at the body, but at the soul. The crowd stiffened. Amos wasn't exposing secrets. He was saying aloud what everyone already knew, but had learned to ignore. His voice tore through the veils of self-deception, through the carefully woven stories the nation told itself. This was not accusation, it was revelation. The power behind his voice was not from rhetoric or human persuasion. It was spiritual fire. What he spoke came from a place beyond human authority. The words didn't just strike ears, they echoed in consciences. Some glanced at each other, visibly uneasy. A few turned away, pretending not to hear. Others whispered dismissively, trying to reduce the moment to nothing more than a dramatic outburst. But the tone of Amos did not waver. His eyes did not flinch. His mouth did not tremble. He had not come to win applause. He had come to speak a warning. While the echo of Amos's voice still lingered in the streets of Samaria, carried between the stones of the palace courtyards and the shadows of the temple gates, something deeper began to unfold. The words he had spoken were not the end of the message, they were only the surface. What God entrusted to him next came not through speech, but through vision. Heaven didn't just speak through sound, it revealed through image. Living revelations that seemed to split open the veil between realms and set divine truth before his very eyes. The first vision came suddenly. Before him stretched a green, fertile field, thriving, vibrant, full of life and promise. Crops danced in the wind. The land looked blessed, but without warning. A swarm of locusts descended like a moving shadow across the sky. They fell upon the field in a rush, devouring everything in their path: stalks, leaves, grain, fruit. In seconds, the scene of beauty turned to ruin. The field was stripped bare. All that remained was dust and silence. No food, no future, no hope. The weight of the vision fell hard on Amos's chest. He knew what it meant. This was Israel. This was what awaited them. The devouring was not just physical, it was spiritual, economic, moral. If no change came, everything would be lost. He could not stay silent, even though he had been sent to declare judgment. Compassion rose like fire within him. He cried out to God, not with carefully crafted words, but with the desperate plea of a man watching a nation fall apart. Lord God, please forgive. How can Jacob stand? He is so small. And for a moment, it seemed, heaven paused. But the visions did not stop. Next came fire, not the fire of a hearth or a sacrifice, but something more ancient, more terrifying. It spread across the land like divine fury, consuming everything it touched. It scorched valleys and climbed hills. It reached deep into the earth, down to the very abysses. Even the rivers evaporated. The ground itself cracked and smoldered. The air in the vision grew so hot that Amos could feel it on his skin. Suffocating, unbearable. It was judgment in pure form. Again, Amos interceded. His voice trembled as he begged for mercy. O Lord God, please cease. How can Jacob stand? He is so small. He stood between heaven and a nation on the edge, knowing that even judgment, when revealed fully, was almost too much for the heart to bear. But God was not being cruel. He was revealing how serious the condition had become. What Amos saw was not punishment for its own sake. It was a holy warning, and there was no more room for denial. Then came the third vision. No fire, no swarming devastation, just a hand, the hand of the Creator, holding a plumb line, a simple tool, used by builders to measure whether a wall was upright. But this was not in the hands of a carpenter, it was in the hands of God, and He was measuring not stone, but people, not structures, but hearts. The meaning was unmistakable. The moral structure of Israel was crooked. What had once been aligned had now warped. Their foundations were compromised, and God, the master builder of all creation, would not overlook a wall on the brink of collapse. Each vision stripped away another layer of illusion. The people believed themselves safe, chosen, stable, but Amos's visions exposed what no song in the temple could hide. They were off-center, misaligned, and too proud to admit it. Amos's message became more than words. It was weight, it was warning, it was fire in human form. His voice, once dismissed as noise from a shepherd's throat, now struck like an axe at the very roots of Israel's arrogance. And the sound of that axe, the sharp clarity of divine truth, began to bother many, especially those who had the most to lose. Among those who felt most threatened by Amos's message was Amaziah, the priest of Bethel. He was not just a religious official, he was a gatekeeper of the kingdom's spiritual facade. A man who had built his influence within the walls of ritual and order. The temple at Bethel, where he served. It was no longer a house of God, it was a center of power, a spectacle, and royal allegiance. To Amaziah, Bethel was sacred because it gave him status. And now, a rugged shepherd from the south was standing in that very space, tearing down everything with nothing but his voice. Amos's words struck directly at the core of everything Amaziah represented. He didn't speak in riddles or poetry. He accused, he revealed, he condemned, and the people were listening, even if only in silence. Amaziah knew he had to act quickly. If he allowed this voice to continue, it wouldn't be long before the illusion of stability began to unravel. First, he tried to discredit Amos through the channels of political power. He sent a message to King Jeroboam, carefully worded, crafted to stoke fear. Amos is plotting against you in the very heart of Israel. He warned, the land cannot bear all his words. Amaziah framed the prophet, not as a man of God, but as a political insurgent, a southerner stirring division, undermining the kingdom's peace. But Amos was not moved. He was not preaching for applause, nor hoping to impress kings. He had no ambitions to climb temples or build followings. His assignment had not come from a throne or a priesthood. It had come from the voice that called stars into being, and that voice had told him to speak. When political manipulation failed, Amaziah confronted him in person, standing before Amos. The priest tried to diminish him with mockery cloaked in civility. Go away. Seer, he said with thinly veiled disdain. Return to Judah. Eat your bread there. Prophesy in your own land. But don't speak here, not in Bethel. This is the king's sanctuary. This is the kingdom's temple. Thee is not to. The insult was sharp. It was meant to remind Amos that he did not belong, that he was an outsider with no pedigree, no institutional covering, no right to speak. But Amos did not flinch. His reply came like a hammer. I was no prophet, nor the son of a prophet. I was a herdsman, and a dresser of sycamore figs. But the Lord took me from following the flock and said to me, Go, prophesy to my people Israel. The moment hung heavy in the air. Amos wasn't defending himself. He was clarifying authority. He had not come by bloodline, not by training, not by aspiration. He had been interrupted by heaven, and obedience had become his only option. What Amaziah saw as weakness was, in fact, divine selection. And no priest, no king, no crowd could revoke what God had commissioned. Still, the tension didn't ease. If anything, it grew sharper. Opposition against the prophet rose like a tide. Rumors spread. Eyes narrowed. The message was too raw, too real. The crowd began to divide between those who ridiculed him and the few who, despite themselves, felt the weight of truth behind his words. But Amos kept speaking. His voice, forged in solitude and fire, continued to echo through palaces built on injustice, through markets filled with vanity, through temples heavy with pretense. His words were not crafted to entertain. They struck like iron on stone. In the public squares, where no one dared challenge the status quo, he stood declaring aloud what others only whispered in secret. And still, the blade of truth pressed deeper. One day, standing amid the bustle of Samaria, Amos turned his gaze toward the wealthy merchants parading through the markets. Their robes shimmered with imported dye, their sandals untouched by dust, their laughter full of indulgence. They moved through the streets like royalty, oblivious to the suffering at their feet. And as Amos watched them adorned in luxury and insulated by wealth, something in him stirred. The voice that had burned within him now rose again, this time with a tone that blended holy indignation and sorrow. He spoke not with hesitation, but with the boldness of one carrying heaven's weight. "You cows of Bashan," he declared, eyes fixed on the elites of Samaria, both men and women alike. The words cut the air like a whip. It was a jarring metaphor, audacious, even scandalous. In the lush region of Bashan, the cattle were famously well-fed, large and pampered. To be called one was to be accused of bloated excess, fattened privilege, and shameless self-indulgence. But Amos was not interested in pleasing sensibilities. These were people who lounged in comfort while the poor were crushed beneath the weight of their greed. And he wasn't done. He painted scenes of corruption with unsettling clarity. In the markets, merchants used dishonest scales, shaving weight off every purchase while inflating prices. The poor, already burdened by drought and debt, were pushed further into despair with every transaction. Even the sweepings of wheat, the worthless remnants, were collected, packaged, and sold to the desperate as if it were real food. Their suffering had become just another business model. And still, Amos went deeper. His voice turned toward the religious centers, toward Bethel and Gilgal, places filled with priests and incense and feasts. These were supposed to be holy spaces. But Amos saw the truth: performance, not purity. He pointed at the altars. He raised his voice above the chants and choirs. I despise your religious festivals," he declared. "Your assemblies are a stench to me." Bakun, it retention. Gasps followed. The crowd stiffened. Some scoffed. Others stared, frozen. But Amos did not stop. He said their songs meant nothing. Their offerings were rejected. Their sacrifices were hollow. because the rhythm of the tambourine could never drown out the silence of injustice, because no amount of ritual could disguise a heart estranged from righteousness. Then he delivered the line that would echo through generations: "Let justice roll down like a river, and righteousness like an everlasting stream." Well, the image was staggering. Not a trickle of goodness, not a ceremonial drop, but a flood relentless, wild, cleansing, washing away every pretense and lie. It was what God truly desired, not empty worship, but living justice, not grand offerings, but hearts aligned with heaven's order. The silence that followed was thick, but it wasn't peace, it was pressure. Uncomfortable murmurs began to ripple through the crowd. Nervous laughter bubbled at the edges, some in mockery, others in fear. The merchants clutched their cloaks. The priests exchanged tight glances. No one could pretend they hadn't heard. Amos's voice had reached the palace gates and the temple walls. His words had become unbearable, not because they were false, but because they were too true. And yet he continued, not out of anger, but out of obedience. He knew the message was hard, but he also knew something deeper. God never sends a warning without holding out a thread of hope. Beneath the judgment was always the offer of return. Beneath the fire was the possibility of restoration. In the midst of his storm of warnings, amid visions of fire and famine, while the streets still trembled from the weight of his condemnations, Amos began to speak of something else, something unexpected. His voice, once sharp like a sword, now carried something gentler, quieter, and yet no less powerful. He began to speak of restoration. It was like a single light flickering in a starless sky, the kind of light that doesn't erase the night, but dares to pierce it. Amos, the prophet of judgment, began to reveal a future that glowed with promise. In that day, he declared, "I will raise up David's fallen tent. This was no hapid, with this deed or wers the ram, and the rond in hes on the res." To many, it sounded almost impossible. That old name David evoked a memory of unity, simplicity, and closeness with God. The tent was not the grandeur of temples built with cold stone and golden walls. It was the intimate shelter of worship, relationship, and trust. What Amos spoke of was not merely a physical reconstruction, but a spiritual realignment, a revival of covenant. And his words didn't stop there. He described scenes of overflowing abundance, vineyards heavy with fruit, so much so that the reapers would still be gathering grapes when the plowman arrived to sow again. Fields so fertile that the rhythm of planting and harvest would blur into one endless season of provision. The cycles of lack, hunger, and despair would be broken. In their place would be feasting, laughter, and songs echoing across the hills. But this vision was not only agricultural. Amos saw a scattered people returning home, exiles, outcasts, the displaced. He spoke of cities once destroyed being rebuilt, of gardens planted with peace, of families dwelling in safety. It was more than recovery, it was redemption. The broken would be restored, not just physically, but spiritually. Those who had lost their identity would find it again. Those who had forgotten the sound of belonging would hear it in the walls of new homes. His message cut across the present reality like a sword of contradiction. In a time filled with inequality, oppression, and approaching disaster, he dared to speak of a coming joy. It was jarring. Many could not grasp it. How could such beauty rise from the ashes of judgment? How could songs emerge from a nation on the edge of collapse? But Amos didn't speak hope cheaply. He didn't offer comfort to avoid confrontation. His hope was like a seed planted in hard, dry ground, stubbornly waiting for the rain. And even as he prophesied these promises, the air around him grew heavier. Resistance surged. Whispers turned into arguments. The powerful grew increasingly agitated. Some accused, others plotted. The people were restless, divided between awe and defiance. And Amos could feel it, something shifting beneath the surface. Not just resistance, but something worse. Silence. A kind of spiritual pause that felt more terrifying than rage. The moment was reaching a threshold. His mission, once met with disbelief and derision, was now meeting something colder, more final. And yet, he kept speaking because heaven had not stopped. After all that was said, after the visions declared, the judgments thundered, and the glimmers of hope quietly offered, Amos began to withdraw from the center. Not because he had failed, not because his strength had waned, but because something in him knew the words had been released. The fire had been lit, and the rest would now be in the hands of time and conscience. There was no need to say more. The roar that once broke through Israel's noise gave way to a silence that spoke louder than any speech. It wasn't retreat. It was release. The streets he once stood in now carried an echo. Some of the people were still murmuring about him, trying to interpret the layered meanings behind his warnings and promises. His name passed from mouth to mouth, curious, uncertain, unsettled. But among the elites, the tone was different. The powerful preferred mockery to memory. Who was he anyway? They asked, scoffing, dismissing the shepherd prophet as a temporary disturbance from the hills of Judah. They tried to reduce him to nothing more than a strange voice that had come and gone uninvited, uncredentialed, and, as they hoped, soon to be forgotten. But what they didn't understand was that his voice had already left an imprint. His words, though no longer shouted in the public square, were still moving quietly, steadily, like waves breaking against a shoreline. You could ignore them. You could pretend they didn't matter. But you could not stop them. The prophet had stepped back, but the word he carried was still walking through the land. The absence of details about Amos's last days only adds to the mystery. He simply disappears from the pages of history, vanishing like a shadow into the hills that once shaped his voice. There is no record, no farewell, no last words etched in stone. Perhaps he returned quietly to the fields of Tekoa, walking again among his sheep and tending to the fig trees, the same trees that once required his patient hands to bear fruit. Perhaps he lived the rest of his days in solitude, watching the sunset over golden hills that had once heard his whispered prayers. Or maybe, just maybe, he continued on, proclaiming God's message in distant villages, speaking truth into silence, even when no one remained to applaud or record. And yet, what followed was not a disappearance into irrelevance. The silence that came after was not an end, it was an interval, a divine pause. Like the hush that falls between the lightning flash and the thunderclap, it was as if heaven itself had left a blank space on purpose, a sacred silence for reflection, for choice, for consequence. The people were left alone with his words, no longer shouted from street corners, but still alive, beating like a second heartbeat beneath the surface of the nation's conscience. Even so, the story of Amos did not disappear. His voice, once dismissed, once mocked, did not die in the dust of Samaria's courts. Instead, his message lived on, passed from generation to generation like a prophetic ember smoldering through time. His words remained alive, not because they were loud, but because they were true. And truth has a strange way of enduring even when no one wants to hear it. His words became a reminder, a sacred echo of what justice, integrity, and the courage to obey God's call really mean. Though many rejected him in his time, his voice grew louder in the years that followed, echoing across scrolls, scriptures, and the hearts of prophets who came after. His message, although simple in essence, carried a fire so fierce it could not be smothered. Each sentence was like a hammer blow to falsehood, each warning like lightning cutting through deception. And still, every word he spoke came from a place of obedience, not ambition. Amos was no ordinary man. He had no prophetic lineage, no royal ties, no formal schooling under temple scribes. And yet, even without titles or a religious pedigree, he left a mark that time could not erase. It was as if heaven chose the unqualified to carry what the qualified refused to touch. The strength of his conviction, born in the fields, forged in silence, and delivered in fire, became a legacy that stretched far beyond his lifetime. The image of the plumb line, the river of justice, the cows of Bashan. These weren't just poetic phrases, they were holy metaphors, seared into the memory of a people who could no longer pretend they hadn't been warned. His metaphors were mirrors, revealing the soul of a nation that had forgotten what righteousness looked like. They outlived the kings, the priests, and the merchants who once scoffed at him. They became eternal reference points, not only for Israel, but for every land where injustice hides behind wealth and hypocrisy dares to kneel at the altar. And perhaps the most haunting part of Amos's legacy is this: his silence speaks just as loudly as his words. Because somewhere, in the quiet that follows the prophet's final cry, the question remains not just for them, but for us. What will you do when truth no longer pleads for your attention, but waits for your decision? Amos showed us something eternal, that true worship isn't found in gold-covered altars, incense-filled rituals, or loud songs sung without sincerity. It's not in the performance of religion, but in the practice of righteousness in justice, flowing like a mighty river, not trickling through convenience or preference. His voice rose not in temples, but in open spaces, in streets, among those who had no voice of their own. He stood for the forgotten, the mistreated, the crushed, and he confronted the powerful with words that burned like coals on hardened hearts. He embodied a holy kind of courage, the kind that doesn't come from education, platform, or permission, but from obedience. The kind of courage that comes when heaven taps a shepherd on the shoulder and says, "One, go," even when no one wanted to listen. Amos didn't soften his message, even when they mocked his accent, dismissed his background, and silenced the applause. He stood his ground. Because he wasn't echoing his own opinion, he was carrying the burden of the Almighty. To this day, Amos's legacy doesn't just survive, it breathes. It moves in every act of justice done in silence, in every time someone speaks truth without a mic, in every humble soul who chooses conviction over comfort. His voice didn't die in the streets of Samaria. It lives on in our resistance to systems that crush, exploit, and deceive. His story is a living reminder that transformation often begins in the most unexpected places, not from kings, not from priests, but from a man in dusty sandals with calloused hands and a fire in his bones. And as we reflect on his life, one question begins to echo, not as an accusation, but as a divine invitation. Is the river still flowing through us, or have we built walls to contain what was meant to run wild? Perhaps, even now, like Amos, we're being called to something greater, something unglamorous, unpopular, and undeniably holy. Something that demands not just belief, but boldness. And so, his story intertwines with ours, not as a distant chapter, but as a living script. It invites us to listen with open hearts, to act with fierce compassion, and to become agents of the justice Amos once roared about. For the river of righteousness still waits, and the world still needs it to flow. Amos's story didn't end with applause or acclaim. It faded into history the way it began, quietly, but with a resonance that refuses to die out. He was no more than a shepherd, a man whose hands were shaped by the roughness of bark and stone, whose feet knew the dust of the hills better than the marble of any palace. Yet this ordinary man was entrusted with a divine message, fierce enough to rattle the very pillars of a kingdom, not because he spoke like a scholar or ruled like a priest, but because he dared to obey and believe. And that's what gave his story such lasting weight. He reminds us that when God seeks a voice, he doesn't scan resume, he searches hearts. From the sun-scorched hills of Tekoa to the echoing courts of Samaria, Amos bore witness to a truth that still unsettles and inspires. Worship without justice is noise. No matter how beautiful the music, no matter how grand the temple, if love for neighbor is absent, then heaven is not listening. Can offerings please God if they come from hands that exploit the poor? Can praise move heaven when justice has been gagged? Amos's life wasn't a call to comfort, but to confrontation, not for the sake of rebellion, but for righteousness. He exposed the kind of faith that costs nothing, demands nothing, and changes nothing. And by doing so, he called out to those who had been cast aside, the crushed, the silenced, the forgotten, and gave their pain a voice. His message still burns. Turning our faces away from injustice doesn't make us innocent, it makes us complicit. When he cried for justice to flow like a river and righteousness like a never-ending stream, it wasn't just for Israel's ears. That cry slices across centuries. It beckons to every generation, every nation, even now. Are we still measuring ourselves with the plumb line of truth? Are our hands building a world God would dwell in? Or just propping up what's comfortable for us? This may be Amos's greatest legacy, the revelation that God can thunder through anyone, at any time, in any place. The only question is whether we will be willing enough, surrendered enough, brave enough to be that vessel. Not perfect, just obedient. Because like Amos, we too can become a voice where silence has prevailed, a vessel through which justice might flow again. And what remains to be asked is not whether the call is real, but whether we are ready to answer it. Because that first trembling yes from a shepherd long ago was the spark that lit a revolution of truth. The story of Amos doesn't end with silence. It ends with a question that still echoes through generations. His voice may have faded from the streets of Samaria, but the weight of his message has only grown heavier with time. Amos wasn't a scholar. He wasn't trained in the courts of prophets. He was a man of the soil, with calloused hands and a heart sharpened by obedience. And yet, when he spoke, heaven moved and kingdoms trembled. What made his voice unforgettable wasn't status or eloquence. It was truth, and in a world increasingly allergic to truth. His words still ring like thunder. Let justice roll on like a river, and righteousness like a never-failing stream. He didn't demand perfection, he demanded alignment. He showed us that the true measure of worship isn't in rituals, performances, or polished speeches, but in the way we treat the poor, the forgotten, the voiceless. That message isn't just ancient, it's urgent. Today, injustice still walks boldly in plain sight. Oppression wears modern clothes. And religion, if we're not careful, can still become performance rather than presence. The words of Amos aren't distant echoes from the past. They're mirrors held up to our present. And that raises the question, are we truly listening now? I believe we are living in days that call for the same kind of courage. Not the courage to be loud, but the courage to be faithful. Not the courage to win arguments, but to live out truth. You don't have to stand on a stage or hold a microphone to be prophetic. Sometimes, the most powerful sermons are lived in silence, in the choices no one sees, in the stand you take when it costs you something. That's what Amos taught us, and what he continues to teach. That God often chooses the unseen, the ordinary, the underestimated. That justice isn't a trend, it's a lifestyle. And that the most sacred callings often begin in the most unlikely places. If this message spoke to your soul, I invite you to take a moment like this video. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more prophetic storytelling, and tap the notification bell so you never miss a revelation. And leave a comment below what part of Amos's journey stirred something in you, what justice still needs your voice. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening to a story that still speaks. And never forget your yes, like Amos's, might be the beginning of a ripple that outlives you.